Welcome to another episode of The Nuclear Gamble, one mistake away from World War III. America versus Russia missile exchange. On Life Facts Daily, we will be having insight on how the world stands on the edge of knife. Nuclear powers clash in silence, waiting for one mistake. What begins as a border conflict threatens every continent. The Cold War never truly ended, it only slept. Now, the old enemies rise again, stronger, more dangerous. Proxy battles ignite across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Each move brings us closer to the unthinkable. One wrong step, one wrong order. That's all it takes to turn tension into annihilation. From cyber attacks to tactical nukes, the stage is set. The world is armed to destroy itself in minutes. But who will dare strike first? Peace is fragile, and the line between defense and destruction disappears. From Europe to Asia, the flames spread without mercy. Nations fight not for victory, but survival. And in the shadows, the nuclear clock ticks louder. For more insightful stories, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share our channel. The world is sliding toward catastrophe, one decision at a time. What began as a tense standoff has now spiraled into something far darker. The Alaska summit was supposed to ease tensions, but instead, it cracked NATO's unity wide open. Washington tried to paint it as diplomacy, yet Europe saw betrayal. Ukraine was sidelined, and Moscow was emboldened. Putin had played his hand masterfully. With the United States distracted, Europe divided, and NATO's credibility shaken, he saw his chance. Spetsnaz units were already mapping targets. North Korean artillery crews drilled in the shadows. Belarusian forces stood ready. What the world thought was peace was nothing but bait. The European response was swift but reckless. A so-called peacekeeping force marched into the disputed zone, determined to prove Europe still had teeth. French tanks, German APCs, and Polish watchtowers dotted the landscape like fragile markers of defiance. To Moscow, it was exactly what they wanted, a scattered force, poorly protected, ripe for destruction. At dawn, the trap was sprung. Precision strikes shattered 3 isolated bases. Thermobaric firestorms consumed French paratroopers in seconds. Chemical rounds crippled German outposts. Polish special forces were overrun in the chaos. By sunrise, silence hung over the battlefield. 800 soldiers gone in a single night. The images shook Europe to its core. Macron called it a day of infamy. Poland declared mobilization. Germany invoked Article 5. NATO's foundations trembled. And yet, in Washington, hesitation reigned. The White House stalled while Europe bled. Inside the Kremlin, generals smiled. This was exactly the fracture they had planned for. But Europe would not wait. Poland pushed east with everything it had. French and German divisions followed, despite American warnings. For the first time in decades, a European war was being fought without U.S. leadership at the front. And in that space, Moscow unleashed its next move. Columns of Russian armor surged westward. North Korean artillery thundered behind them. Belarusian infantry carved paths through abandoned villages. NATO troops scrambled to hold the line, but their strength was stretched thin. Desperate radio calls echoed into the night. Air support, reinforcements, anything to stop the tide. In Washington, the president faced an impossible choice. Step in and risk nuclear escalation. Hold back and watch NATO collapse. Carrier groups sailed, bombers were armed, troops deployed. But Moscow was already preparing its answer. This was no border clash. This was the opening act of something far greater. A conflict that could pull every nation into its orbit. And as the first American and Russian forces exchanged fire, the world crossed a line it could never uncross. But what came next would decide the fate of humanity itself. But in those first critical hours, chaos reigned on every front. Europe scrambled to coordinate. Communications broke down as cyber attacks swept across NATO networks. In Berlin, ministers argued over deployment orders. In Warsaw, Generals bypassed bureaucracy and pushed troops east without hesitation. The streets filled with volunteers, ordinary citizens ready to fight for their homeland. Meanwhile, Moscow unleashed its propaganda machine. Russian state media framed the strikes as defensive operations against Western aggression. They showed images of captured NATO soldiers, paraded like trophies. In Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un declared his army was standing shoulder to shoulder with Russia, proving North Korea's strength on the global stage. For his regime, this was more than war. It was validation. On the ground, the battlefield was unforgiving. In eastern Poland, NATO mechanized units clashed with Russian armor in brutal, close-quarter engagements. HIMARS systems launched, salvo after salvo, tearing through Russian convoys. But for every column destroyed, two more seemed to emerge from the forests. The sheer scale of the Russian-led advance stunned even veteran commanders. And then came the skies. NATO scrambled its air wings, sending F-35s and Eurofighters screaming into battle. Russian Su-35s rose to meet them. Dogfights lit the heavens over Poland, missiles carving bright trails across the night. Entire cities shook as falling wreckage crashed into streets and fields. Civilians fled in panic, highways jammed with endless convoys of refugees. But the most chilling weapon was yet to come. Deep inside Russia, long-range missile crews prepared their launchers. The order was clear: disrupt NATO's logistics at all costs. Within hours, cruise missiles streaked across the Black Sea, slamming into bases in Romania and Bulgaria. One strike hit a U.S. supply hub, killing dozens of American soldiers. For Washington, this was the final straw. The president addressed the nation. His words were calm, but his message was clear: America was now at war. Carrier strike groups moved into the Baltic and Mediterranean seas. Thousands of U.S. troops poured into Europe. The world held its breath, because this was the moment everyone had feared. The United States and Russia were now in direct, open conflict. But beneath the surface, something even darker was unfolding. Reports surfaced of tactical nuclear units being moved to the front. Satellite images showed convoys carrying weapons no one dared to acknowledge. Was Moscow preparing to cross the ultimate red line? Or was it just a bluff meant to paralyze NATO into submission? Europe braced itself for the answer. And in the shadows, a new kind of war was already underway. Cyber strikes took down power grids from Warsaw to Paris. Drones infiltrated cities, targeting infrastructure and sowing terror. Propaganda flooded social media, twisting truth into chaos. The battlefield was no longer just tanks and missiles. It was everywhere. And as night fell again on a burning Europe, one fact became undeniable. This was only the beginning. The true storm had yet to come. Europe burned. Cities that had once been centers of culture and history were now reduced to rubble. Warsaw, Vilnius, and Kharkiv glowed with fire as artillery pounded relentlessly. Civilians poured westward, millions displaced in only days. Refugee camps overflowed, and entire nations strained under the weight of a crisis not seen since the Second World War. But the battlefield was not confined to Eastern Europe anymore. NATO's counterstrikes reached deep into Russian territory. Supply depots, rail hubs, and fuel lines were targeted with precision bombing. Explosions lit up the night skies over Belgorod and Bryansk, shaking Russian confidence. For the first time, Moscow's citizens felt the war creeping toward their doorstep. The Kremlin's response was swift and merciless. Russian commanders ordered saturation bombing campaigns across NATO staging grounds. Hypersonic missiles, nearly impossible to intercept, struck air bases in Poland and Germany. One missile slammed into Ramstein Air Base, killing hundreds and wiping out critical U.S. assets. The West reeled, and then the whispers began, whispers of nuclear deployment. Satellite images revealed convoys moving warheads into Belarus. NATO intelligence confirmed that Russia had activated its tactical nuclear doctrine: escalate to de-escalate. The threat was clear: Moscow was prepared to use small-yield nuclear weapons to shatter NATO's will. In Washington, the president convened his war council. Military leaders urged caution. Hawks demanded a direct response, warning that hesitation would only invite more aggression. Across Europe, leaders begged America not to back down. The alliance was united in fear, but divided in strategy. Meanwhile, in Asia, the war's shadow grew longer. North Korea declared total mobilization, sending tens of thousands of troops westward. Kim Jong-un promised to deliver a final blow to Western arrogance. South Korea, terrified of being next, began quietly arming itself. Japan followed suit, and the Pacific suddenly trembled on the edge of war. China, silent until now, moved pieces on its own chessboard. Naval fleets expanded patrols in the South China Sea. Intelligence leaks hinted that Beijing was supplying Moscow with covert support, surveillance data, weapons, and diplomatic cover. The conflict was no longer just Russia versus NATO. It was transforming into something larger, something global. On the ground, NATO soldiers held the line in brutal, close-quarter battles. In forests, villages, and broken cities, firefights raged for hours. Drones filled the skies like steel locusts. Tanks rolled across fields blackened by fire. Casualties mounted on both sides, the numbers too large to process. Every death pushed the world closer to madness. And then came the moment that nearly shattered the fragile balance. A Russian tactical nuke was armed, mounted on an Iskander missile near the Belarus-Poland border. NATO's satellites picked it up instantly. For 30 agonizing minutes, the world stood still, waiting to see if the missile would launch. News of it leaked across the internet, sparking panic in cities from London to New York. But the launch never came. The order was delayed, perhaps canceled at the last second. Yet the message was unmistakable. The nuclear threshold had been reached. The next escalation might not stop short. As NATO regrouped for a massive counteroffensive and Russia doubled down with fresh reinforcements, the future of the world dangled by a thread. And in the silence between explosions, a chilling realization spread across every capital. This was no longer just Europe's war. It was becoming a world war. And the worst was yet to come. The war had spread beyond Europe. In the Middle East, old rivalries ignited under new flames. Iran, emboldened by Russia's defiance, ramped up attacks on U.S. and Israeli interests across the region. Proxy militias launched missile strikes on American bases in Iraq and Syria. Tankers in the Persian Gulf were torpedoed, choking the flow of oil and sending global markets into freefall. Israel responded with ferocity, striking Iranian positions directly. Within days, the region was engulfed in chaos, pulling the U.S. into yet another front it could not afford to ignore. Meanwhile, the cyber battlefield raged without pause. Entire power grids collapsed. Banks froze. Hospitals lost critical systems. In New York and London, entire cities fell into darkness as cyber attacks crippled infrastructure. Panic spread, not just from bombs, but from the terrifying realization that nowhere was safe. Back in Europe, NATO launched its largest counteroffensive yet. U.S. armored divisions rolled through Poland, supported by German and British air power. The skies above Belarus turned into a storm of missiles and dogfights. Russian defenses held, but barely. The front lines stretched into a grinding stalemate, an echo of World War I in the digital age. But Moscow still held its ace, nuclear escalation. The Kremlin made a chilling announcement. Any NATO incursion into Belarusian territory would be met with a response the world would never forget. And with that, the world edged closer to the abyss. The Pacific erupted. North Korea, no longer content with supplying troops to Russia, launched missile tests over the Sea of Japan. One missile veered dangerously close to Japanese territory, sparking outrage in Tokyo. Within hours, Japan activated its long-dormant war powers. The United States pledged full defense of its ally, and carriers diverted from Europe to the Pacific. China seized its moment. Warships blockaded Taiwan, cutting off critical supply lines. Beijing denied it was taking sides, but its actions spoke louder than words. The dream of global dominance was within reach, and the West was too divided to stop it. In Europe, NATO's counteroffensive broke through parts of the Russian line. Polish and American troops recaptured key cities, but the cost was devastating. Casualties climbed into the tens of thousands. Entire towns were reduced to dust. The war had become one of attrition, resources, manpower, and endurance. But the breaking point came when Russian bombers launched a massive strike against the NATO headquarters in Warsaw. Hundreds of senior officers were killed. The alliance was thrown into disarray. And for the first time, serious discussions began in Washington and London. Should NATO respond with a limited nuclear strike to deter Moscow? The very question split the alliance. Some argued it was the only way to end the war. Others warned it would doom humanity. And as the debate raged, Russia prepared its next move. It happened on a cold morning that the world would never forget. At 6:42 a.m., a Russian Iskander missile carrying a tactical nuclear warhead detonated in an open field near the Polish border. The yield was small by Cold War standards, but its impact was enormous. A blinding flash lit the skies, followed by a mushroom cloud that could be seen for miles. The blast vaporized NATO armor caught in its path. Thousands were killed instantly. Radiation spread across farmland, poisoning the earth. And the psychological shock was even greater. For the first time since 1945, a nuclear weapon had been used in war. The world erupted in panic. Stock markets collapsed. Cities emptied as people scrambled for shelters. Protests exploded in every capital, citizens demanding peace, fearing annihilation. NATO convened an emergency summit. The choice was unbearable: retaliate in kind or risk appearing weak. Britain and France moved nuclear warheads into readiness. The United States placed its forces on DEFCON 2, the brink of all-out war. But Moscow warned that any nuclear retaliation would be met with full-scale escalation. Humanity now dangled by a thread, one misstep away from extinction. And yet, in the chaos, a darker plan began to take shape. Some leaders no longer sought victory. They sought survival, even if it meant betraying allies or making secret deals with the enemy. The war had crossed into madness. The nuclear detonation shattered the old world order. Alliances cracked under the pressure. Some European nations secretly opened back channels to Moscow, desperate to shield themselves from the fallout. Others demanded absolute commitment to total war. NATO unity hung by a thread. On the battlefield, the war grew more brutal. Chemical weapons were unleashed in contested cities. Drones swarmed skies in endless waves. Civilians became targets as each side sought to break the others through terror. Entire generations were being erased in weeks. In Asia, the Pacific theater boiled over. North Korea launched a full assault on South Korea, opening a second war. U.S. forces were now split, stretched thin across two continents. China tightened its grip on Taiwan, daring the West to respond. And in the Middle East, the chaos spread further. Turkey clashed with Russia-backed forces, Israel fought Iran, and oil flows ceased entirely. The world economy collapsed. Starvation began to stalk nations. For ordinary people, survival became the only war worth fighting. Shelters filled. Governments rationed food and fuel. Chaos reigned in cities. The promise of civilization crumbled under the weight of endless war. And yet, behind closed doors, in bunkers and hidden chambers, world leaders faced the ultimate question. Was it time to launch a full-scale nuclear exchange, to end the war once and for all, no matter the cost? The silence before that decision was the most terrifying of all. And as the world held its breath, one truth became undeniable. This was not just World War III. This was humanity's final gamble. Finally, the world had marched into war step by step, blinded by pride, fear, and ambition. What began as a clash in Eastern Europe had spiraled into a conflict that consumed every continent. Nations fell into chaos. Economies collapsed. Civilians paid the ultimate price. And when the first nuclear weapon was detonated, humanity crossed a threshold it could never uncross. World War III was no longer a possibility. It was reality. But the war was not just about territory or power. It was about survival. Each decision by world leaders pushed humanity closer to the edge, where one misstep could mean extinction. The lesson was brutal, but undeniable. In a world armed with weapons capable of ending civilization, war can no longer be won. It can only be survived. And as the smoke rose over cities and nations fractured, one question echoed louder than all the bombs, louder than all the guns. Would humanity find a way back from brink? Or have we already written the final chapter of our history? For more chilling and informative stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, share, and like our channel. Life Facts Daily.